The town of Grimsley had always been shrouded in a veil of darkness, its history marred by tragedy and whispered tales of horrors long forgotten. But there was one story that persisted, that lingered in the minds of the townspeople like a festering wound. The story of the House of Mirrors. Tucked away on the outskirts of town, hidden behind a dense forest that even the bravest of souls dared not venture into, stood an ancient mansion. Its once grand facade was now a decaying relic, windows boarded up, and ivy crawling up the crumbling walls like skeletal hands trying to drag the house into the earth. The mansion was said to be cursed, its halls echoing with the screams of the damned, and at its heart lay a room that no one dared to enter, the Room of Mirrors. The story began years ago, with a man named Victor LaSalle, a renowned illusionist who had moved to Grimsley in search of solitude after a series of failed performances that had left him broken and bitter. Victor had a fascination with mirrors, believing them to be windows to another world, a place where the reflections weren't just images but living, breathing entities trapped in a glass prison. Victor's obsession grew over time, and he began collecting mirrors from all corners of the world. Some were ornate, gilded with gold and jewels, while others were simple, their surfaces cracked and tarnished with age. He lined the walls of his mansion with them, filling every room until the house itself became a labyrinth of reflections. But it was the room at the center of the mansion that held his greatest creation, a room where every inch of the walls, floor, and ceiling was covered in mirrors. This was the Room of Mirrors, a place where Victor believed he could finally reach through the glass and pull the reflections into his world. What Victor didn't know was that the mirrors he had so carefully collected were not ordinary mirrors. They were cursed, each one containing the soul of a person who had died a violent, tragic death. The souls were trapped, their anguish and torment reflected endlessly in the glass, waiting for someone to set them free. Victor's experiments began innocently enough. He would spend hours in the room, staring into the mirrors, trying to communicate with the souls trapped within. At first, there was nothing, just the cold, silent reflections staring back at him. But then, things began to change. It started with whispers, soft at first, barely audible, but growing louder with each passing day. The voices were desperate, pleading, crying out for help. They spoke of the pain, the suffering, and the endless torment of being trapped in the mirrors. Victor, driven mad by his obsession, began to listen, convinced that he could free them, that he could bring them into the real world. He spent days, weeks, and months in the Room of Mirrors, neglecting his health and sanity, until one night, the voices finally stopped. Victor, delirious with anticipation, believed that he had succeeded, that the souls were ready to cross over. He stood in the center of the room, surrounded by the mirrors, and began the ritual. But instead of freeing the souls, Victor had unleashed something far worse. The mirrors began to shudder, their surfaces rippling like water. Victor watched in horror as the reflections in the mirrors began to change. They were no longer his reflection, but twisted, grotesque versions of himself. Their eyes hollow and black, their mouths stretched into unnatural, wicked grins. The room grew cold, the air thick with the stench of decay. Victor tried to leave, but the door had vanished, replaced by another mirror. He was trapped, surrounded by his own nightmares. The reflections began to move, stepping out of the mirrors and into the room. They were no longer mere reflections but living, breathing abominations. Victor's own dark doppelgangers, born from the souls he had tried to free. The doppelgangers advanced on him, their movements jerky and unnatural, their hollow eyes fixated on him. Victor screamed, but no sound came out. The doppelgangers reached out with cold, clammy hands, their touch like ice against his skin. They tore at him, ripping his flesh, their laughter echoing through the room. Victor's screams filled the mansion, but no one was there to hear them. The townspeople had long abandoned the mansion, too afraid to go near it. By morning, the mansion was silent once again, the only sound the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. The Room of Mirrors was still, the mirrors reflecting only emptiness. Victor was gone, his body and soul consumed by the dark forces he had unleashed. The mansion remained, a silent sentinel, its walls echoing with the horrors that had taken place within. And the mirrors, they waited, their surfaces smooth and inviting, reflecting nothing but shadows, waiting for the next unfortunate soul to step into the House of Mirrors and meet the same fate as Victor LaSalle. The House of Mirrors stood empty for years, a cursed relic that no one dared to approach. The townspeople spoke of it in hushed tones, warning their children to stay away from the forest that surrounded it. But as time passed, the stories faded into legend, and the fear that had once gripped Grimsley began to loosen its hold. It was during this time that a group of college students, emboldened by youth and a thirst for adventure, decided to explore the mansion. They had heard the tales, of course, but they dismissed them as mere superstition, the ramblings of a town too afraid to confront its own past. They were determined to prove that there was nothing to fear, that the House of Mirrors was just another old, abandoned building. The group consisted of 5 friends: Mark, the confident leader; Sarah, the skeptic; Jason, the joker; Emily, the quiet one with a secret love for the macabre; and David, the one who always followed the crowd, never wanting to be left behind. They had spent weeks planning the trip, gathering supplies and mapping out their route through the forest. On the night of their departure, the air was thick with anticipation, a nervous energy that none of them could quite shake. The journey to the mansion was uneventful, the forest eerily silent as they made their way through the twisted, overgrown paths. The trees seemed to close in around them, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, but the group pressed on, driven by a mixture of curiosity and bravado. When they finally reached the mansion, it was just as they had imagined. An imposing structure, its grandeur long faded, with broken windows and a door that hung loosely on its hinges. The air around the house was heavy, suffused with a sense of dread that none of them could quite place. But they ignored the feeling, laughing it off as nerves, and pushed open the door. The interior of the mansion was even more dilapidated than the outside, with dust and cobwebs covering every surface. The air was stale, carrying the scent of mold and rot, and the only light came from the moon filtering through the broken windows. As they stepped inside, their footsteps echoed through the empty halls, a hollow sound that seemed to linger in the air long after they had moved on. Mark took the lead, guiding the group deeper into the mansion. They explored room after room, finding nothing but decay and the remnants of a life long abandoned. But as they moved through the house, a sense of unease began to settle over them, a feeling that they were not alone. Emily was the first to notice it, a faint sound, like whispering, coming from somewhere deep within the mansion. She stopped, straining to listen, but the sound disappeared as quickly as it had come. She shook her head, dismissing it as her imagination, and hurried to catch up with the others. It wasn't until they reached the heart of the mansion that they found the Room of Mirrors. The door to the room was unlike any they had encountered so far, ornate and heavy, with strange symbols carved into the wood. Mark hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering over the doorknob, but then he shook off the feeling and pushed the door open. The room was a sight to behold, its walls, floor, and ceiling covered entirely in mirrors. The moonlight reflected off the glass, creating a kaleidoscope of shadows and light that danced across the room. It was beautiful in a haunting, surreal way, and for a moment, the group was struck silent by the sight. But as they stepped inside, the beauty of the room began to fade, replaced by a growing sense of unease. The mirrors seemed to distort their reflections, twisting their faces into grotesque caricatures, their eyes too large, their mouths too wide. Jason, always the joker, laughed it off, making faces at his reflection, but the others were not so easily amused. Sarah, the skeptic, moved closer to one of the mirrors, peering at her reflection. But what she saw wasn't herself. It was something else, something darker, lurking just beneath the surface. Her reflection's eyes were black, hollow pits that seemed to stare into her soul, and as she watched, the mouth began to move, forming words that she couldn't hear but could feel, deep in her bones. She stumbled back, her heart pounding in her chest, but when she turned to the others, they were gone. The room had changed. The mirrors that had once reflected the room in perfect symmetry now showed only darkness, an endless void that seemed to stretch on forever. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she realized she was alone, trapped in a room that was no longer just a room, but something far more sinister. The whispers returned, louder this time, filling the room with a cacophony of voices. They spoke in languages she couldn't understand, but the tone was clear: anger, pain, and something else, hunger. As Sarah backed away, the mirrors began to ripple, their surfaces distorting as something moved behind the glass. She could see shadows, shapes that shifted and twisted, trying to break through. Her reflection was no longer hers, but a twisted, nightmarish version of herself. Its eyes black and soulless, its mouth stretched into a grin that was too wide, too sharp. The mirrors shattered all at once, a deafening crash that sent shards of glass flying through the air. Sarah screamed, covering her face as the pieces rained down around her, cutting into her skin. When she opened her eyes, the room was dark, the mirrors replaced by an endless void. And then she heard it, the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the darkness. Sarah turned, her heart pounding, as a figure emerged from the shadows. It was Mark, or at least it looked like him, but there was something wrong. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes, they were black, just like the reflection she had seen in the mirror. "Mark," she whispered, her voice trembling, but the figure didn't respond. It just stared at her, its head tilted slightly, as if trying to understand what she was. And then, without warning, it lunged at her. The last thing Sarah saw was her own reflection in its black eyes, twisted and distorted, just like the mirrors that had once lined the walls. The House of Mirrors had claimed another victim, its curse living on, feeding on the souls of those who dared to enter. And as the mansion stood silent once more, the mirrors began to reform, their surfaces smooth and inviting, waiting for the next group of fools to venture into the darkness. The story of the House of Mirrors would continue, a tale of horror that would never die, just like the souls trapped within its glass walls. The House of Mirrors had grown quiet again, its latest victims absorbed into the darkness, their souls now a part of the cursed mansion's legacy. The remaining three, Mark, Jason, and David, were scattered throughout the house, unaware of Sarah's fate, each lost in their own nightmare. Mark had been the first to notice Sarah's absence, but the shifting hallways of the mansion made it impossible to retrace their steps. The walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own, twisting and warping as he moved through them, leading him deeper into the heart of the house. He called out for his friends, his voice echoing through the empty corridors, but the only response was the distant sound of footsteps that never seemed to come closer. Jason, the Joker, found himself in a room filled with mirrors, smaller than the one they had entered before, but no less disturbing. His reflection grinned back at him, but the expression was wrong, too wide, too manic. He tried to laugh it off, to brush away the unease that gnawed at him, but the laughter died in his throat as the reflection began to change. It started with the eyes, darkening, the whites fading into a soulless black. Then the skin began to peel away, revealing raw, bloody flesh beneath. Jason's reflection grinned wider, its teeth now sharp and jagged, a mockery of the smile he had worn just moments before. He backed away, but the mirrors followed him, closing in from all sides until he was surrounded by his own monstrous doppelgangers. Jason's screams echoed through the mansion, but they reached no living ears. David, always the follower, found himself alone in a room that seemed to stretch on forever. The floor was lined with broken glass, the shards reflecting his terrified expression in 1,000 fractured pieces. He tried to find a way out, but every door led him back to the same room, the same endless corridor of mirrors. It was Emily who found the truth, or perhaps the truth found her. Unlike the others, she had always been drawn to the darkness, fascinated by the macabre. As she wandered the house, she felt an almost magnetic pull toward the room of mirrors. She knew, somehow, that it was where the curse had begun and where it must end. When she finally reached the room, it was different from before. The mirrors were gone, replaced by walls of pulsating black glass that seemed to absorb the light, drawing it into an abyss. At the center of the room stood a figure, Victor LaSalle, or what was left of him. His body was twisted and broken, his skin pale and translucent, his eyes black voids that stared unblinking at Emily. But he wasn't alone. Around him, emerging from the walls of black glass, were the others, the souls he had trapped, the doppelgangers that had claimed the lives of those who entered the house. Emily felt no fear, only a cold determination. She stepped forward, her reflection merging with the shadows that surrounded her, becoming one with the darkness. The whispers grew louder, the voices of the damned, but she didn't flinch. She understood now. This house, these mirrors, they were not just cursed. They were alive, feeding on the souls of those who dared to enter. And the only way to break the curse was to confront it head-on. Emily reached out, her hand touching the cold glass. The surface rippled under her touch, and she felt a surge of energy pass through her, as if the house itself was trying to pull her in. But she held her ground, forcing herself to push deeper into the glass, until her hand passed through the surface and into the void beyond. The room began to shake, the walls shuddering as the curse fought back. The black glass cracked, splintering into 1,000 pieces, but Emily didn't stop. She pushed forward, her entire body passing through the glass until she was fully submerged in the darkness. There was a moment of absolute silence, a stillness that seemed to stretch on forever. Then, with a deafening crash, the mirrors shattered, the shards exploding outward in a storm of glass and darkness. When the dust settled, the room was empty. The mirrors were gone, the black glass reduced to dust that blew away on an unseen wind. The curse had been broken, the souls released, the house finally free of the darkness that had consumed it for so long. But there was no sign of Emily. Outside, the sun began to rise, its light cutting through the fog that surrounded the mansion. The forest was silent, the only sound the rustling of leaves in the wind. The mansion, once a place of horror and despair, now stood empty, its windows clear, its walls no longer echoing with the screams of the damned. The House of Mirrors was no more. As the townspeople ventured back into the forest, they found the mansion in ruins, a crumbling shell of what it had once been. The curse had been lifted, the darkness dispelled, but the memory of what had happened there would linger, a reminder of the horrors that had once plagued Grimsley. And in the silence of the ruins, if you listened closely, you could still hear the faint sound of a woman's voice, whispering from somewhere deep within the shadows, a final echo of the souls that had been trapped in the House of Mirrors. But no one dared to listen too closely.